Hey class, welcome to chapter 14, section 2. The slavery issue intensifies. The relationship to the North and the South is only getting worse, and is primarily heated around the slave issue. A number of slaves and former slaves began to get involved in the issue. One lady that played a major part was a lady named Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman acted as a conductor for the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a network of people who aided runaway slaves to freedom. Of course, the goal was to get them all the way north, possibly all the way into Canada if they could. And it was through like a network of homes. They would go to different white people who were sympathetic toward the slave cause, who were actually called abolitionists, meaning they hated slavery, and they provided safety, provided protection for them as they went. And Harriet Tubman was a leading contributor as a former slave. She would actually return to the South 20 times, risking her own freedom to help rescue and help lead 300 slaves to freedom. She becomes known as Moses because she helped to lead her people out of Egypt, just like Moses had done in the Bible. So, a pretty remarkable lady. A couple other important slaves and former slaves of the day are these folks. Right here on the left, we have Frederick Douglass. He was a prominent black leader. He actually escaped from slavery in 1838 and would go on to lecture across the North in Great Britain, raised a lot of money to help free slaves. A very important person. He would write a book called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass that kind of told his story. He would later publish a newspaper called the North Star, which helped to guide slaves to freedom. So he really was a strong leading voice in the abolitionist cause. And these two guys here on the right, Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, they are two slaves that helped to lead a slave revolt. People often think, why didn't the slaves revolt? There's 50 of them, there's maybe one master. Why didn't they revolt? I gotta tell you, revolts never worked. And when you got caught, you got hung. There were some slave revolts led by Vesey and Turner that did result in a number of white people getting killed, but none of them result in freedom for slaves. It makes the slave owner a little more paranoid. He may sleep with a gun under his pillow, but these revolts don't work. What these revolts did do by Vesey and Turner was it caused more fear and paranoia in the South. They actually began to outlaw the teaching of reading and writing to slaves. They felt like if they could read and write, then they'd be more likely to try to revolt together and unify and gather together. Another individual to help bring about change and to add fuel to the fire between the North and South was a lady named Harriet Beecher Stowe. And she writes this book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And the life of slaves and runaway slaves was brought to light in this book by her. The book will go on to sell 300,000 copies in its first year of publication. More copies of this book will sell in the 1850s than any other book, and is regarded as one of the most influential pieces of literature. The novel rallied support in the North as more and more Northerners became abolitionists after hearing her tales of what slave life was like. The book was banned in the South because they saw it was all horrible. Notice the quote here from Abraham Lincoln on the bottom. I find it very interesting. He actually is going to say, upon meeting Harriet Beecher Stowe, he says, "So, you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." Almost in a positive way, right? This book helps to ignite the war, and it's a powerful piece of information that is used by a lot of Northerners to join the abolitionist cause. As we've talked before, anytime new land gets added, new property is added to America, it always ignites the slave issue. And this was no different when Kansas and Nebraska began kind of appealing to become states and become territories. So a man named Stephen Douglas, he passes a law called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And what the Kansas-Nebraska Act said was that those states would be popular sovereignty states. Remember, that's where the people have a voice, people have a say as to whether the state would be slave or not. And so what's going to happen, it's going to be crazy. We're going to have Southerners flocking to Kansas, Northerners flocking to Kansas, and they're going to vote. They're going to vote to determine whether or not Kansas would have slaves or not. Well, only the most ardent, extreme supporters of those two causes are going to go to Kansas. And once they get there, chaos is going to ensue. An event called Bleeding Kansas breaks out. There's violence between the abolitionist Northerners who hate slavery and the fire eaters in the South who love slavery, and led by men like John Brown over here, who are going to go to Kansas for this cause and kill people over the slave issue. And Bleeding Kansas happens, and just shows the tension and shows the differences between the North and the South, and the chaos that ensues, and just the really difficult stuff going on. And all this, of course, we're getting closer and closer to Civil War happening. Another event that adds fuel to the fire is about a former slave, or a slave named Dred Scott. Dred Scott is a slave owned by a man named John Emerson. Well, John Emerson had lived on free soil for a while, lived in free area for a while, and Dred Scott lived with him. So when Emerson dies, Dred Scott says, hey, you know what? I should be free because my former slave owner lived on free soil for a while, therefore I should become free. Well, at this time, the new Chief Justice, John Marshall, has died by this time. Well, a man named Roger Taney has become the new Chief Justice, and Roger Taney says two really key things. One, he says, Dred Scott, you're a slave. You're not a citizen. He says, Dred Scott, you're not a citizen because you're a slave. You can't sue. You can't sue in this court, first of all. The second thing he said was, he says, if I take you away and give you freedom, I'm taking you away from your new master. Because, of course, John Emerson's children would have inherited him. And if I take you away from your new master, I am then depriving that person of property without cause, without reason to do so. The Constitution says you can't deprive someone of life, liberty, or property. And he says, Dred Scott, you are just a piece of property. You're not a human being with human rights. And therefore, you don't have the rights to go free. You're just property. And this announcement by the Supreme Court, the highest law in the land, outrages many Northerners. And again, pours a little more fuel on the fire, creating greater division between the North and the South upon Civil War. And one last event I want to talk about today that added fuel to the fire was an event at Harper's Ferry. Now, when I think ferry, I think of a boat that carries cars. That's not the case here. Harper's Ferry is a location. It's a city in Virginia. At Harper's Ferry, there was a federal arsenal. Arsenal are weapons. So it's federal military equipment and supplies. And so at Harper's Ferry, John Brown, again, the guy who's a little bit crazy, his sanity was questioned. He had been at Bleeding, Kansas, and so now here he is at Harper's Ferry. He's tried to get this a rally of slaves with him to help take over this arsenal and gather these weapons and then have a big attack. Well, unfortunately for him, it doesn't happen, and slaves don't join him because it's just too hard, and they don't. It's never successful for them, and by the end of it, four of Brown's sons were killed. Excuse me, two of his sons were killed, and they killed five pro-slavery men. And Brown gets arrested, and Brown really becomes the symbol of the North. The Southerners think that all Northerners are crazy abolitionists like John Brown who will kill people for ending slavery. And because of that, you see John Brown getting hung for his acts against the South. And this just continues. This just continues to add fuel to the fire. So a number of events here, all of which would increase the tension and widen the gap between the North and the South prior to Civil War and will lead to Civil War.